Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this UNE Business School seminar. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land that we call New England and show respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging of this nation. Today we have Mathew. He's a good collaborator here at the UNE Business School. He has presented a few seminars. And yeah, if you don't know Mathew, he's a lecturer here at the business school. He specializes in history of economic thought, and his research focuses on the 19th century economic thought, which is particularly interesting these days, with some of the idea of American Protectionist school that originated with Alex Hamilton and his contemporaries. Mathew earned his PhD in 2024, last year, at the Federation University Australia, and he got the Heads-Up Prize for Best Doctoral Thesis from the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia, and the 2025 Terenzio Martelli Prize for Best PhD Dissertation from the Italian Association for History of Economic Thought. So congratulations for all this achievement, Mathew, and thank you for sharing your research with us. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Here we go. Okay, got the clicker there. Okay, thanks everyone for coming along to my presentation, and thanks again to Emilio for arranging this seminar. Looks like we have a few more coming in. The topic of today's presentation is Alexander Hamilton, Tench Coxe, and the Diversity of Talents, a neglected argument in early American protectionist thought. I'll just adjust the camera so I'm in view. Now, I think it's important to begin by giving a background into the key figures involved to make the rest of the discussion go more smoothly. So as the title suggests, the two main protagonists in this story is Alexander Hamilton and Tench Coxe, but also the lesser-known William Barton, who also plays a role in this story. Now, all three of these figures worked in the Treasury Department during the first Washington administration. So Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the US Treasury. Tench Coxe was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and William Barton was Chief Clerk of the Treasury. Now, during this time, Alexander Hamilton and Tench Coxe, they co-authored a document known as the Report on Manufactures. So often it's only credited to Hamilton, but we know from archival evidence that Tench Coxe was also responsible for authoring the document as well. And this document was communicated to Congress on the 5th of December, 1791. And it argued that for both the independence, but also the economic well-being of the United States, that America should protect and develop manufacturing. Now, typically, historians of economic thought have viewed the Report on Manufactures as important because it represents the first articulation of what's known as the infant industry argument. And this argument basically says that in order to allow infant industries to develop and catch up, it's necessary to provide temporary protection from more advanced foreign competitors through the likes of protective tariffs so that they can develop the technological capabilities, the necessary skills and economies of scale to be competitive internationally. However, in the report, there's an equally powerful argument, which is the focus of today's presentation. And this is the argument from the diversity of natural talents, dispositions and aptitudes, or what I'll refer to from now as the diversity of talents argument. So we'll return to the role of Coxe and William Barton later on in the presentation, but let's get into the argument itself. Quite a lot of text on there now. I'm looking at it from here. So the argument can be found on page 11 of the report. So according to Hamilton, as to furnishing greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from one another, this is a much more powerful means of augmenting the fund of national industry than may at first sight appear. It is a just observation that the minds of the strongest, most active powers for their proper object, so he's talking about industry here, may fall below mediocrity and labour without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits. It is hence to be inferred that the results of human exertion may be immensely increased by diversifying its objects. When all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the whole vigour of his nature. There is in the genius of the people of this country a peculiar aptitude for mechanic improvements. It would operate as a forceful reason for giving opportunities to the exercise of that species of talent by the propagation of manufactures. So here Hamilton is arguing that every individual possesses unique talents, aptitudes and dispositions, and in order to allow individuals to actually exercise these distinctive qualities, it's necessary to cultivate a diversity of industry. So this is one of the arguments put forth in favour of protectionism in the report. If you impose a broad-based protective tariff, then you're cultivating a diversity of industries, and this creates greater scope for different individuals to actually exercise their unique talents. And this isn't only worthwhile because it allows individuals to undertake employments that are most congenial and most meaningful. It's also important for economic growth and prosperity. As Hamilton says, the minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper object will form below mediocrity if confined to uncongenial pursuits. So this differs significantly from classical trade theory and even modern neoclassical takes on classical trade theory. If you look at both Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage and David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, these theories argue that in order to maximize economic welfare, nations should specialize in a particular industry or narrow basket of industries. But Hamilton is arguing the exact opposite. You need economic diversification. Specialization may make sense if you assume that everyone is identical. So if you assume that labor is a homogeneous factor of production, it might make sense. But if you take into account this diversity of talents, aptitudes, and dispositions, specialization is actually harmful economically because certain talents will remain dormant and unutilized. So that's basically, in short, what the argument is. Okay. Now, there is another reason why this argument is important, and it's important because it represents a challenge to the dominant narrative in the secondary literature on Hamilton's economic thought. So what you largely find, if you look at the secondary literature, is there is this argument that Hamilton is basically adapting Smithian economics to divergent policy outcomes. And you can see all the sources above. They more or less affirm this view. And this also feeds into a broader narrative about American economic thought in general. And that's the argument that American economic thought is largely unoriginal. American economists were essentially adapting classical economics to protectionist conclusions. And if you're interested in understanding why that argument is incorrect, you should buy my book when it comes out next year. So. In any event, it might seem like a foregone conclusion that it must be the case that Hamilton is simply adapting Smithian economics if you have so much of the secondary literature affirming this conclusion. So who am I to challenge this? Well, what you find when you look at the secondary literature, for the most part, these aren't independent sources corroborating one another. They're not going back and reading the primary literature of Hamilton. They're going back and they're citing other secondary sources. And when you follow the chain of citations, what you find is it almost always goes back by this article by Bourne, which was written in 1894. So this isn't actually the main argument of the paper, but I think it's worth reflecting on whether this narrative is actually as credible as first appears. Now, by the way, I should just clarify that I'm not arguing that Smith didn't have an influence on Hamilton. I think he did. For example, one of the arguments actually given by Hamilton for encouraging manufactures was he thought that manufacturing was more conducive to the division of labour. And that's a key concept found in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So I'm not arguing outright that Smith didn't have an influence on Hamilton. What I'm challenging is this exaggeration in the secondary literature that Hamilton was basically just adapting Adam Smith. Okay, so what does Bourne have to do with all of this? Well, to make the case that to make the case of Smith's heavy influence on Hamilton, what he does is he takes 20 passages from the Wealth of Nations and he compares it to 20 passages found in the Report on Manufactures. And this supposedly confirms the connection between Hamilton and Smith. Now, it might seem overwhelming if you have this many parallels between the two. There must be some linkage there, right? But I think what has happened is the secondary sources have just accepted what Bourne had to say uncritically. They didn't actually go through and scrutinize the passages presented by Bourne. They just accept it on face value, because when you actually go and look at the vast passages from the Wealth of Nations and compare it to the Report on Manufactures, often it isn't very clear what really they have to do with each other. Often they're just vague and generalized discussions with only the slightest relevance. Sometimes the specifics are completely different, and sometimes it's Hamilton criticizing Adam Smith. So, but I might just illustrate this by looking at the first passage given by Bourne. So this is actually a snapshot taken from Bourne's article. So from the Wealth of Nations, to quote Smith, it says, though they, the colonies, had not therefore been prohibited from establishing such manufactures, yet in their present state of improvement, a regard to their own interest probably would have prevented them from doing so. Okay, so this, so that is from Smith, and this supposedly influenced Hamilton to say that the expediency of encouraging manufactures in the United States, which has not long since been deemed very questionable, appears at this time to be pretty generally admitted. So what actually is the connection here? It's pretty vague to me. It isn't really clear what they have to do with each other. And I think it might help to look at the full Smith quote in context. So let's look at a more complete passage. So this text comes right before the quote presented by Bourne from the Wealth of Nations. So what Smith actually said is, such prohibitions on manufacturing may not hitherto been very hurtful to the colonies, since they can import from the mother country all the more refined and advanced manufactures cheaper than they can make for themselves. So it seems to me that Bourne is grasping at straws here. You know, in the full context, Adam Smith is arguing that it's in the interest of Britain's colonies, or that they should just be content with importing manufactured goods from Britain, where Hamilton is arguing that we should develop manufacturing. So it's very vague, actually, what this connection is. Now, I'm not cherry picking. This is the first series of passages presented by Bourne, and there's plenty of other ones where the supposed parallel seems just as flimsy as this one. In any event, I'm bringing this to your attention because I don't think we can just take it for granted that the secondary literature is more correct here. And I think when we consider the diversity of natural talents, it's very clear that Hamilton is not adapting Smithian economics. In fact, he's completely at odds with Smith's thinking on this matter. Okay. So Smith and Hamilton, they have almost diametrically opposed conceptions of human nature when we look at this. So we have the following quote from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. The difference of natural talents in different men is in reality much less than we are aware of, and the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions is not upon many occasions so much the cause as the effect of the division of labour. The difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature. So here, Adam Smith is denying, or at least downplaying, natural differences in talent. He's making the case that differences in individuals is actually the result of experience, and in particular, the division of labour. So it's not something that's innate. Now, I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and there was a Smith scholar there who insinuated that I was cherry-picking Smith. So I actually went back and I reviewed Smith's writings. And what you actually find is that this is not an isolated occurrence. There is another work by Smith called Lectures on Jurisprudence, and Adam Smith is affirming the exact same thing. So if you go to his Lectures on Jurisprudence, it says the dispositions to barter is by no means founded upon different genius and talents. It is doubtful if there be any such difference at all. So again, here Smith is denying differences in talent, natural talents and genius. He then goes on to say that the difference between a porter and a philosopher in the first 5 or 4 years of their life is, properly speaking, none at all. And among the savages, there is always the greatest uniformity of character. So he's basically saying that naturally, in the state of nature, everyone is uniform. You don't have these natural differences in talent. What appears to be these differences in talents is a product of the division of labour and experience. So that's what Smith's arguing here. And even if you look at the passage from the Wealth of Nations, so this first passage here, this isn't some obscure quote tucked away in some, on page 400 of the Wealth of Nations. This is on page 16 of the first book of the Wealth of Nations. So Smith is here positing this up front. And, Smith is a very deep and meaningful thinker. It seems to me that he was putting this up front because he actually thought this and he wanted to emphasize the point. But in any event, this is incredibly different to what Hamilton has to say. Hamilton is very firm in the view that there is this diversity of natural talents, and so much so that in order to allow these talents to be exercised, we must encourage economic diversification to accommodate them. Okay, so just to summarise what we've had said, Smith denies or at least downplays the existence of natural differences in individuals. Labour is essentially homogeneous. Hamilton views that there is an immense variety and difference in individual natural traits. So Hamilton is arguing that labour is both highly heterogeneous but also innately heterogeneous. So it isn't really the case that Hamilton is simply adapting Smithian economics to divergent policies. These are different conceptions of human nature, and differing conceptions of human nature are axiomatic. It's arguably one of the most fundamental things in economics. If economics is the study of how individuals, produce, distribute, and exchange, it's arguably one of the most fundamental things in economics. And you can see from this how Adam Smith arrives at the conclusion of free trade. If labour is homogeneous, then labourers, by their very nature, cannot be locked into uncongenial pursuits. So nations should specialise under free trade. So buy where is cheapest, according to Adam Smith. But if you agree with Hamilton that individuals do indeed possess unique talents, then you want to allow economic diversification through the likes of protective tariffs so you can accommodate these different talents and aptitudes and dispositions. Now, even though the infant industry argument has been the argument which has captured the most attention, in my opinion, I think the diversity of talents argument actually represents a far more serious challenge to free trade economics and classical trade theory. And this comes despite the report on manufactures being most considered as important because of the infant industry argument. So when it comes to the infant industry argument, as the name suggests, the emphasis is on infant industries. So it only really justifies the temporary use of protectionist policies to allow these industries to develop. The other thing, and this isn't exactly an argument that I subscribe to, but I've seen other scholars argue it, so I'll present the case here, is you get this argument that the infant industry argument isn't inconsistent with the implications of comparative advantage in the long run. In the long run, you should still specialise according to the theory of absolute or comparative advantage. Now, I don't think that quite holds, because if you look at the theory of comparative advantage, it's to do with fixed costs between nations, where if you look at the infant industry argument, it's to do with dynamic costs between nations. But anyway, that's not the topic of today's talk, so we'll put that aside for now. The other thing is what you tend to find is that the infant industry argument, scholars tend to pay lip service to it, but it's kind of something which they easily brush off. If you look at most undergraduate textbooks, that's probably not the best example, but even graduate textbooks, actually, they'll say the same thing. They'll mention the infant industry argument, but then it will just be kind of dismissed as an exception to the broader argument for free trade under comparative advantage, or the more modern neoclassical renderings of Ricardo's theory. Now, the diversity of talents argument, it actually challenges free trade much more directly. First, if you take this diversity of talents seriously, then it doesn't simply justify infant industry protection, it actually justifies a permanent tariff to maintain economic diversification. In fact, specialization along the lines of classical trade theory is not a good thing according to this argument, because if you specialize in a particular industry or a narrow basket of industries, you're actually harming economic welfare because certain talents will remain dormant and unutilized. So it's an argument which goes to the very axioms that underpin classical trade theory. And it's actually for this reason, if you look at the arguments given by 19th century American economists that were following Alexander Hamilton, they do mention the infant industry argument, but by far the more common argument actually used during these by these economists during the 19th century is actually this diversity of talents argument. Now, this isn't simply a historical debate that has no bearing on modern scholarship. Modern Ricardian trade models that are still used by economists today, they're still operating on the assumption that labour is a homogeneous factor of production. So this arguably provides a powerful challenge to modern trade theory when you think about it. So it challenges the assumptions of modern international trade models. Okay. So we've looked at the significance of the argument and how it challenges the conventional narrative concerning Alexander Hamilton and American economic thought more broadly. But let's turn to the second major argument put forth in my paper. And this relates to the origin of the argument itself. Now, it's important to recall from earlier that there was those three key figures. So obviously we've talked about Hamilton, but also Tench Coxe, the co-author of the Report on Manufactures, and also William Barton, the chief clerk. We'll get to Barton in some coming slides, but we'll just focus on Coxe and Hamilton for the moment. Now, I was critical of the secondary literature earlier, but just to demonstrate that I have consistent standards, I'm actually critiquing myself here. So to quote my PhD thesis, it should not be concluded, however, that Coxe influenced Hamilton, as Hamilton's first draft, which was written before Coxe, also contains reference to the diversity of talents. I should just justify, though, just not to diminish the value of my own PhD, that was just in a footnote. It wasn't the main argument of the PhD. I just want to make that clear to everyone that I think the PhD as a whole still holds. So you can rest assured that I earned it. Thanks, Renee. Okay, so after doing some more research and re-examining the primary text, I think that I can actually safely conclude now that I was wrong, and Tench Coxe was actually the architect behind this argument, and he went on to influence Hamilton. So this is actually incorrect. It's a shame they have a public record of it and you can't go through and delete it, can you? Anyway.
Remember that it's recorded.
I think it's a sign of maturity that everybody admits that they learn something new. So I think it's actually really nice that you come out and said that, yeah, what I said in the past was different.
And the other thing, it also demonstrates I'm not just recycling research from my PhD, it's some new research. So there's also that. So anyway, this is incorrect. By the way, in presenting this argument, went ahead. In presenting this argument, I'm also not trying to diminish the contributions of Hamilton. So I'm not actually suggesting that Tench Coxe was the brains behind the Report on Manufactures and he did all the heavy lifting. So what my view is that the Report on Manufactures was really a fusion between the ideas of Hamilton and Coxe. And just to demonstrate this, whilst I'm arguing that this diversity of talents argument comes from Coxe, it's pretty evident when you look at the broader writings of Hamilton that many of the arguments contained in the Report on Manufactures can actually be traced to Hamilton. And just to give you an example of this, so the infant industry argument can clearly be traced to Hamilton. Now, whilst most of the secondary literature cite the Report on Manufactures as the first articulation of this argument, this isn't actually true. If you actually go back into Hamilton's writing, he wrote a series of essays about a decade prior called The Continentalist, and there's a paper within that called Continentalist number 5, and in that's actually where Hamilton first expresses the infant industry argument, not in the Report on Manufactures. The other thing is there's a fair bit of discussion of taxation in the report on manufactures, Coxe doesn't talk all that much about taxation, but if you go to the Continentalist, but also two other papers, or series of papers, the Federalist Papers, Hamilton talks about taxation in the Federalist Papers, and there's also another report called the Report on the Impost, which is largely a discussion of taxation. And those ideas, so you can trace those ideas in the Report on Manufactures to these earlier papers written by Hamilton. So there wasn't one person doing the heavy lifting, it was a fusion of ideas, but when it comes to this argument in particular to do with the diversity of natural talents, I think we can safely conclude that it came from Tench Coxe. Now, tracing the evolution of this argument is rather intricate and complex. So I've created a timeline which should hopefully make it easier to understand the development and trace the origins of this argument. So this timeline illustrates the lead up to the final report on manufactures, which was communicated to Congress on the 5th of December, 1791. Now, there was a series of different drafts of the report. We'll get into that, but I actually discovered that the first instance of this argument actually appeared in 1789, so 2 to 3 years before the final report on manufactures, and this was a tract written by Tench Coxe. So if we go to this tract, which is Observations on the Agriculture, Manufactures and Commerce of the United States, and I actually stumbled across this while researching something else, and then it stuck out to me and I was like, wow, this actually undermines what I said in the PhD. So caused me to reevaluate what I was thinking. In any event, to quote Tench Coxe, Coxe says that the creator and benefactor of man has in great wisdom and goodness so diversified the natural talents, genius and dispositions of mankind that they have a natural propensity and turn of mind to different occupations and employments. Husbandry, for example, is not preferred by everyone as an agreeable employment, nor entered into by those who have a natural propensity for some other occupation, if such could be found and entered into. So a very definitive statement here by Coxe. This is the first record, as far as I can tell, of this argument ever being made. I even went back into the mercantilist literature to try and find if this argument actually appeared in the mercantilist literature, and I haven't found any instances of it. Okay, so let's go back to the timeline and look at the different drafts of the report on manufactures. Now, if you remember, what I said in an earlier slide is I initially rejected the suggestion that Coxe came up with the argument because it actually features in Hamilton's first draft, not in Coxe's first draft. So we have a first draft here by Coxe. It wasn't actually dated, by the way, but evidence seems to suggest that it was written in early 1790. Now, this doesn't contain the argument. Just keep that in mind. It was in the next two drafts from both Hamilton and Coxe, so Coxe's second draft and Hamilton's first draft, that the argument then appears. And what you find is that every subsequent draft and the final report features this argument. But let's first look at the two drafts written by Coxe and Hamilton that first contain this argument and compare the two, and we'll come back to the other drafts later. So this is just a comparison of Hamilton's first draft and Coxe's second draft. Just keep in mind the dates that Hamilton's supposedly came first. Now, they're both very much identical aside from a few variations. So I'll just read from Coxe's second draft, which is the cleaner version. When the variety of human talent is duly remembered and is considered that the minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper object, so it's pretty clear this made it into the final report, may fall below mediocrity and labour without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits, it would appear unwise so as to arrange our political economies as to impel agriculture on the whole body of the people. It is interesting to the prosperity and advancement of the United States that those being peculiarly qualified by nature for the useful arts should find it necessary to call forth their various talents. Then there's a little bit more added to that. Now, if you look at Hamilton's draft, what you see is that there are some additions and deletions. Now, these additions and deletions are actually part of the text itself. words are crossed out, and in the margins between the text, these additions are added to the physical draft itself. Now, there's something very unusual about Hamilton's first draft, particularly if you look at the dating. Hamilton's draft appears before Coxe's draft, yet Coxe's draft appears to be the source material of Hamilton's draft. If Coxe's draft came later, we would expect those additions to feature in Coxe's draft, and we'd also expect those crossed out words to be absent, but they're not. So just judging from the textual variations here, you'd kind of have to conclude that it was that Coxe's draft was actually the source material for Hamilton's draft. But that doesn't make sense in terms of the chronology, because supposedly Hamilton's first draft was written in January, Coxe's second draft was written in September. So it doesn't really make sense that Hamilton's draft truly came first. Now, just some points to note about Hamilton's first draft. We mentioned in the timeline on the previous slide that there was an even earlier draft written by Tench Coxe. This draft doesn't contain the argument from the diversity of natural talents. We've already established that. But something to keep in mind is this first draft written by Hamilton, about a third of that is actually from Coxe's first draft, and it isn't written in Hamilton's handwriting. It's written in the handwriting of the chief clerk, William Barton. So that's something to keep in mind. But something else that's very important to note, if you look at the original manuscript, now some of this draft is written by Hamilton, but you have that additional section that was from Coxe's first draft in Barton's handwriting. There's several additional pages which are also written in Barton's handwriting, and it's in these additional pages written in Barton's handwriting that this argument appears. So we already know that Barton is transcribing material which has been written by Coxe, and this is going into the report on manufactures.
So do we have like plagiarism here?
Sorry?
Do we have some plagiarism here? They plagiarize.
No, I'll get to that in a... He was...
Not anything at that time.
Well, Hamilton commissioned Coxe to actually help him out writing this report. So they were just co-authors writing an article. There's no plagiarism going on here. Right. So when we think about it, we have this additional text that in the report that isn't written by Hamilton. It's not in his handwriting. It's in the handwriting of the chief clerk. And he's transcribing it from material. Well, we know at least that some of the material. By the way, Coxe's first draft occupies about a third of Hamilton's first draft. And then you have those additional pages, right? So it seems to me that Coxe's passage is actually the source material for Hamilton's draft. So how do we actually make sense of this? Because our current understanding is anachronistic, that we have these variations that don't make sense chronologically. It seems to me that the most likely scenario is actually there was an intermediate draft written by Coxe, which has been lost to history. Now, this admittedly is somewhat speculative because we don't have any recording of this intermediate draft, but I don't think the argument is really that far-fetched or controversial. It's very easy for a document like this. If anyone's done archival research, these things just go missing. They're not recorded. But this explanation would explain the anachronisms in the textual variations. Like our current understanding that Hamilton came up with the idea, came up with the passage, it's anachronistic because Coxe's is the source material, it seems, of Hamilton's draft. It doesn't explain why the original source material is contained in a draft by Coxe that's dated later than Hamilton's draft. But a lost intermediate draft would explain this timeline. So it seems to me you had Coxe's 1789 text and his first draft informing this intermediate draft, and that went on to influence both Coxe's second draft and Hamilton's first draft. And then it would eventually make it into the final report on manufactures. That said, my argument doesn't hinge on the fact, on the assumption that there was this lost intermediate draft. There are alternate explanations which would also explain why the argument originated with Coxe. So we already have definitive evidence that Coxe first had the argument back in 1789, so 2 to 3 years before the final report, and before they even started drafting the report. But the other explanation which would help solve these anachronisms in the timeline and the textual variations is if you actually go to the physical reports, drafts of the report on manufactures, there's no specific date recorded on these drafts. All that's written there is 1790. That's all that's written. These dates were actually assigned to the drafts of the report by the editors of the collected works of Alexander Hamilton. And if you go to the footnotes of the collected works of Alexander Hamilton, in the footnotes, they say that these are estimates based on internal evidence, but they don't specify what this internal evidence is. So it's kind of any guess as to what that could have been. Now, it just kind of seems to me, if we want to rule out this lost intermediate draft hypothesis and just weigh up this internal evidence, which we can't judge the veracity of because they don't disclose it, versus direct textual evidence, which is the textual evidence contained in the drafts itself. Just on the bounce of evidence, if we want to rule out this intermediate draft, you'd have to conclude that the dating is incorrect and they made a mistake, and that Coxe's second draft actually appeared before Hamilton's first draft. Again, my hypothesis is actually that there was this intermediate draft which was lost, but if we rule that out, there are alternate explanations which would fit with the broader evidence that we have that Coxe originally came up with the argument, and that the source material seems to that the second draft was the source material of Hamilton's first draft. So I think we can't say with absolute certainty, but I think we can safely conclude from this that Coxe was actually the architect behind this argument. And this actually causes us to reevaluate the history of American economic thought. So the standard depiction, as I mentioned earlier, is that it was Adam Smith who shaped and influenced American economic thought. There was actually a recent book that came out called Adam Smith's America, and it talks about how Adam Smith shaped American economic thought. But I think this unfairly diminishes the influence of Tench Coxe. I think we can certainly conclude that Coxe influenced Hamilton, but we can also see Coxe influencing later protectionist writers throughout the 19th century. Now, what you found into the 19th century, there was two major intellectual hubs of American protectionist thought. The first was Philadelphia, which was arguably the most important. Coxe lived in Philadelphia, by the way, and eventually after the death of Hamilton, a figure called Mathew Carey became the de facto leader of this protectionist movement. Now, he was friends with Tench Coxe. They both were members of the Philadelphia Society for the Promotion of Manufactures, and they were well acquainted with each other. Now, Mathew Carey's... You have a question? No? Okay. Now, Mathew Carey's son, Henry Charles Carey, he would eventually become the thought leader of American protectionism in the mid-19th century. So he was vice president of the Pennsylvania branch of the Republican Party, and he was also the economic advisor of one Abraham Lincoln. So he was a very influential economist in his day. And what you find is that Hamilton is echoing this argument originally put forth by Coxe. Carey says that each rat, robin, fox, or wolf is a type of a species wherever found, possessing habits and instincts in common, but such is not the case in man, in whom we find differences of taste, feelings, and capacities almost as numerous as those observed in human countenance. So it appears that there was this transmission of ideas through Coxe the elder carry, and then to the younger carry. Now, the other hub of protectionist thought was Boston. You probably can't read the quotes just with the lighting, but I'll read them to you, so it's all good. And you find this argument also emerging among the Boston protectionists. So Daniel Webster, he was a prominent Whig statesman. Just for those of you who might not be up to speed with US political history, the Whig Party was the predecessor of the Republican Party. Daniel Webster was a towering figure within the Whig Party. And you have Webster saying, why is the protection to domestic labour useful and necessary to the country? When it comes to this, we have a variety of occupations, and allow me to say that this variety of employments is a matter of great importance to society, for it gives scope to every degree of ingenuity and talent. Now, all these thinkers were well aware of the report on manufactures, so they likely obtained the argument through the report. But we even have Webster citing the broader corpus of Coxe's writing. In other speeches, he's citing from these other works written by Coxe. So I think what I've uncovered actually causes us to reassess the history of American economic thought and to give Tench Coxe the recognition that he deserves. So thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, that's Emilio's job.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks a lot. Oh, we have a lot of questions in the room. And those online, just raise your hand or put in the comments. I will check it.
I've read Adam Smith, and I'm sure everybody would have read them. I was listening to each and everything that you said. It was like a story. It didn't sound heavy on me, though I have no knowledge of, history of economic thought. But what I have observed from my own readings about how America operates as an economy is that they promote, diversity of talent. So I have few knowledge-seeking questions. I'm not challenging anything because I don't know anything.
Yeah.
So this is just knowledge-seeking. One, when you were talking about diversity of talents and you were talking about protectionism, is it diversity of talent in labor or in industry? So what I gathered from what you spoke is that, some of the economists, they thought labor is homogeneous. And then some of the economists thought that no, everybody should be allowed to nurture their diverse talents. So America has gone in for the second one. This is what my observation is, that they allow free nurturing of your unique talents. So my first knowledge-seeking question is it diversity of talent in industries or in labor? Or how is that relevant for modern day American thought? How has that shaped how America operates right now?
Yeah, well, when it comes to the diversity of talents, they're talking about how it's not just labor, it's individuals as a whole have these diversity of talent. So if you look at the writings, they're talking not just about workers exercising their talents by entering into particular industry, they're also talking about entrepreneurs. So not just the laborers, but also the entrepreneurial class and the capital class finding industries that suit their own bent. Now, the whole point of economic diversification, that diversity of industries, is so that you can actually exercise those individuals can exercise the talents that they have. Because if you don't have those industries in place, it's very hard to actually exercise them. You might have some that might be able to go out and, because they have those particular aptitudes, they can start that sort of business and enter into those things. But the idea of the tariff is it gives it a push in that direction, and you're actually cultivating these industries. So that's basically the argument. When it comes to America reverting to protectionist policies, I haven't seen Donald Trump make this argument. In many ways, he's kind of using mercantilist thinking. He's talking about trade balances, and he's talking about using it as almost like political sanctions to get concessions in terms of foreign policy and those sorts of things. So not in this argument, but in my thesis, I try to, which will eventually be in the book, I demonstrate that the protectionists were distinct from classical economics, and you can see that with its diversity of talents. And it's not just Adam Smith. If you get to David Ricardo, which superseded Adam Smith, he's far stronger than Smith when it comes to homogeneous labour. At least in Smith, he talks about acquired traits. He just doesn't think that they're natural. So he's talking about acquired traits. In Ricardo, you don't even get that. He's just kind of viewing a unit of labour as a unit of labour, and that's how it is. So it's not even just a difference with Smith. It's classical economics as a whole that the American protectionists are differing. But it's also mercantilism that they're differing, because these protectionist thinkers, they don't really talk all that much about the trade balance or accumulating gold and those sorts of things. It's about encouraging a diversity of industries. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I'll have some more supplementary, but I think I should get a chance to ask. I can ask you separately.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Thanks, Matt. I found it plausible, in your account of who influenced who and who didn't and what their arguments were. But I just want to get some clarification and maybe even test you a little bit, if you don't mind, on the argument itself and how it follows from the observations that Hamilton and Coxe were making. I take it, so they observed that, we suffer in mediocrity and we don't flourish. We labour without effect if our talents, our peculiar talents, are not given congenial circumstances in which to operate. And I'm assuming that these observations supposedly justify protection in industries which are congenial to those. Say, if Americans have this peculiar aptitude for mechanical improvements, then supposedly the industry in which there's a case for protection is that in which mechanical improvements or an aptitude for mechanical improvements are sort of well deployed and congenial, right?
Yeah.
And this helps to provide Hamilton's argument for, look, we need to broaden our industrial base and get away just from agriculture.
Something I should say, that Hamilton isn't arguing about developing manufacturing to the exclusion of other industries. He wants all kinds of industries. And even when I don't include it here, but if you actually go to another section of the report on manufacturers, he's kind of thinking about the question of, is agriculture in the aggregate more productive than manufacturing in the aggregate? And his conclusion is, in the aggregate, just roughly speaking, they're probably equal. One isn't more productive than the other. That seems to suggest to me that it isn't so much one particular industry, whether it's manufacturing or particular kinds of manufacturing, is more productive than agriculture. It matters that who's doing the industry.
Yeah, I think I get that. But which industries are deserving of protection according to this argument? Are they those in which, if the US has this peculiar talent for mechanical improvements, do the industries that deserve protection, are those industries the ones in which that provide a sort of a congenial workplace for those with an aptitude for mechanical improvements?
But the thing is that it depends on the individual, as in something might be congenial to me. That doesn't mean it's going to be congenial to someone else. So what you get, and this actually even comes out a bit more in Coxe. So you don't want to,
with a peculiar aptitude for mechanical improvements.
Yeah.
So that's a vital premise in this argument, right? We're looking at those people who have this peculiar aptitude.
Yeah.
Let's say, using their example, for mechanical improvements.
Yeah.
And I take it that people like Hamilton and Coxe are saying that okay, there are these peculiar aptitudes. We need to foster industries that are congenial for those with these peculiar aptitudes.
Oh, so you're asking what particular industries they should
Yeah.
foster?
Yes.
Oh, they're talking about cotton, steel, iron, not quite steel at that point, but
That's
pig
exactly
iron.
what I thought. Yeah, good.
Yeah, that's what they're talking about.
Because it would seem that those observations, those premises.
By the way, cotton manufacturing.
Yes, yeah.
Cotton manufacturing, just to clarify.
Yeah. Because it would seem that those observations could equally support, if not more easily support, an argument that goes the other way. Look, we have this peculiar aptitude for mechanical improvements, therefore we have a comparative advantage in manufacturing and so on, where mechanical improvements and congenial. Therefore, manufacturing is the least likely to be in need of protectionism. And I'll just sort of supplement this too. And let's remember that agriculture has always been in need of people with this peculiar aptitude for mechanical improvements. Even 200 years ago, you developed technological improvements with regard to the plough and the tractor were emerging. People with these aptitudes were really vitally needed in industries like agriculture, not just in manufacturing. Anyway, that's my rant, but
right. Okay, two things. I think you might be getting a little hung up on the specific word of mechanic improvements. If we go back to these drafts, I don't even think mechanic improvements mentioned in there.
It wasn't the first.
It was in the first original one.
Yeah.
And if you go back to Coxe's observations, he doesn't mention mechanical improvements. He's making the case some might have a propensity for mechanic improvements, some of them might not. So you have this diversity of industries. But the problem, if you're arguing that it's free trade which causes this diversity of industry, I mean, you can't have it both ways. What is it? The vast bulk of the free trade literature argues that free trade is a good thing because you get gains from trade from nations specializing in particular industries. So you kind of have to throw all that out if you want to make the case that it's actually free trade that encourages economic diversification, because you're not getting those gains from trade from nations specializing in a particular industry or narrow basket of industries. So, there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there if you want to make the case that free trade is both good because it encourages specialization, but it's also good because it encourages economic diversification. Those two things don't really square. So when you think about it.
I guess I'll just reiterate, I don't see how this argument for diversity of talents helps you to decide which industries deserve protection.
Well, doesn't it? You'd protect all industries.
Okay. Which sounds even crazier to me, but okay.
So these guys didn't support the likes of now look, in the report on manufacturers, Hamilton does approve bounties for particular industries. Hamilton was very explicit. He was very cautious about subsidies. He was like, we want these to be very much in the short term, and if they don't work, we should just get rid of them, right? What you find is that almost every protectionist after Hamilton, they rejected subsidies because they thought that it actually privileged one industry over another. And it also privileged particular people in that industry over another, because it's usually just one firm when they wanted to lower barriers to entry. That's part of the reason for infant industry protection. It's lowering barriers to entry. But anyway, if you take the argument, it's about protecting all industries. Yep. Thanks, Jonathan.
When the industry is in an infancy stage, that is when they should be protected. And after a point of time, when they reach to a certain developmental stage, then we can remove protectionism, but with caution. Am I right in interpreting?
When it came to bounties, that's correct. If you kind of look at Hamilton, he argues that, and Hamilton only supported a moderate tariff for both revenue and protection. He kind of argued that that should just be a permanent feature of American policy. And if you look at the later protectionists, It's not just infant industry protection. We want a permanent tariff because look, you need to get revenue from somewhere as well. If you're imposing income tax, which is a lot of what these free traders were arguing, and if you look at the classical economists, they were saying even if you had revenue tariffs, you should actually increase your domestic excise so as to offset that protective effect. Right, what the protectionists were arguing is, well, you need taxation from somewhere to fund government and to fund infrastructure. Does it make sense to tax industry, tax capital, tax income, or does it make sense to tax imports, which has the indirect effect of encouraging industries and promoting this diversity of talents and diversity of industries so that to accommodate people's talents?
We have a Fazlul, and then I would like to make a comment.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. As you did your PhD very recent, I think you are still working on that, exploring some other aspects on this research. So keep in mind in these things, I just have some clarification with complementary, whereas should I say, or suggestion or something like comments.
Yep.
First thing is, when you are talking about the protection,
Yeah.
about the industry or agriculture, anything else, I think the ownership of this entrepreneur, like industry, is that the private ownership or government ownership
Private.
will make sense to go for protection or not. Secondly, the size of the industry, like it's the already flourish industry or the infant industry, maybe there is a difference between the size of industry to be protection or not. Another thing, the diversity of talents.
Yeah.
We already know that the division of labor is already recognized in the economy.
Sorry, is
Division of labor.
yeah.
Division of labor. It means there is a diversity of talents. If we recognize the diversity of talents, then we can recognize the division of labor. So I think the diversity of talents, what Adam Smith says, is not quite maybe correct in some senses. Rather, the Hamilton's argument is quite okay, I think. There is an argument that division of labor, you can supplement this point here. Another thing, when you are talking about the international trade, like you mentioned, the Adam Smith's trade theory and the David Ricardo trade theory, the comparative advantages theory. Along with this, there is another trade theory, like the Heckscher-Ohlin trade theory.
Yeah.
This may be complement with the other two theory. This is the developed theory of international trade, Heckscher-Ohlin theory.
Yeah.
I think if you just go through on that theory, I think it will be helpful to you to more develop your research work. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, not a problem. To your first thing, they are talking about private industry. These guys were adamantly favoring capitalism. They weren't supporting socialism or communism or anything. So, these were basically the architects of American capitalism. So that's something to keep in mind, that it was about private industry. I didn't quite get the point so much about Adam Smith, but like in Adam Smith's account, it's what appears to be natural differences is the result of the division of labor. So he's not saying that the natural differences causes the division of labor. It's the other way around. And it kind of makes sense when you look at Adam Smith's examples. He doesn't so much talk about a diversity of industries. He's talking about subdividing tasks within a pin factory. So it's a very minute subdivision of labor, where what you get with these guys, it's a much more, they even kind of stopped using the division of labor as a term. They just kept using division of employments. Now, in regards to the modern trade theories, like I have had some people say, well, these modern trade theories, they do actually take into account heterogeneous labor, but not really in any meaningful way when you look at it. If you look at those multi-factor Ricardian trade models, which economists are still using, just on a technical level, yes, it is true that they take into account heterogeneous labor, but they're referring to differences in national skill rates. So you'll have country A, which is a high-skilled nation, and country B, which is a low-skilled nation. And those differences between skills will determine what the nation will specialize in under free trade. That isn't, I would not interpret that as a heterogeneous labor model, because within each nation, your labor is homogeneous, and it just doesn't really contend with Coxe's and Hamilton's argument. But I take your point that it, obviously there is a lot to look into. Yeah.
Thank you. I have my own question because I think I want to reflect on this because I think perhaps they describe in different things because we need to remember that economics have a lot of modeling and sometimes we get short with the model. So from one side, yeah, Smith probably is describing about the natural resources that you have, and then you have some divisions in the task, and that creates the division of labor. But from the other side, Hamilton and Coxe were discussing more about the talents, the aptitude that people have, and then I agree with Fazlul that will probably guide the division of labor because you are better doing this. For example, I am not good at mechanic, so I am not able to fix things, but I do other things, maybe more gardening or economics or other things. So basically, when you put this in context of a country, like in US, for example, you have areas that you could have some tropical agriculture, but maybe, or subtropical, but maybe it's a very modest area, maybe Florida or part of, I don't know, California. So basically, yes, some people will have the aptitudes and talents to work there, but maybe because of the condition in the natural resources, you also need to consider that maybe the country is not that competitive. So then you need to consider both things when you deciding, okay, this is an industry that we will want to progress on it, and this is maybe an industry that we don't have much future. They did that in the case of the garlic industry in US with a lot of success, actually. They follow the infant and protectionist approach, and then they protect that industry. And then in contrast to what you were saying, they provide subsidies and they try to technify the industry, and they knew that they could produce good levels, so they could be competitive in that industry. And now it's a competitive industry, and they can remove the protectionist. But if you're going to produce mango or avocado in US, maybe it's not the best. So do you consider that you have both components when you have to decide, okay, the country needs to focus on these things? We have advantages, maybe natural, maybe on the talent from one side, and then in other one you could have the talent, but you don't have the resources, so it will be difficult to compete, or the other way around.
Yeah, but those natural resources are still going to be there if you adopt a protectionist policy. So you're going to have that. If you don't, then the protective tariff just defaults to a revenue tariff, and you're raising revenue on it. So
but
because you can still import, you're just paying a.
But let's go for the case of the avocado. It has been on and on in the case of US because they mostly going to import most of the avocado. So what is the point to have a tariff on avocados? Or maybe coming from Mexico, that is the logical thing. So that is not going to benefit the country. You have some tax revenue, that's true, but on top of that, you use that avocado for eating at home, but also some restaurant, fast food, and other things that you can do. I don't know, like salsita or some sort of food that they could produce using the avocado. But when you put the taxes, you actually punish yourself because you're not going to develop that industry, which is different to the case of the garlic. I just wanted to flag this because there are a lot of things floating around.
But I mean,
yeah.
with these thinkers, there was a diversity of thought among them. I'm kind of speaking in general terms. There were thinkers among these who, if there's an industry that is fundamentally unsuited, then don't put a tariff on it. You know,
that will be the case
if it's fundamentally unsuited. But that doesn't, just because you have these exceptions where it doesn't really make sense to cultivate that particular industry, I don't see how that kind of undermines the argument in general, because, there's nothing stopping you from having free trade in that particular industry if you want to. Like, if there is something that's just fundamentally unsuited, which is mostly agricultural production. But when it comes to manufacturing and other things, now they did support cultivating all industries, but when it comes to manufacturing, a lot of that doesn't really hinge on the natural resources in the country. I mean, Japan followed protectionism after World War II, and they don't have a lot of natural resources. They developed these industrial industries by developing the skill levels and those sorts of things. So, I take the point that, I agree that if there is these industries where it doesn't really make sense, either you could keep it as a revenue tariffs to offset taxes in other areas, or you could just get rid of it. There's nothing stopping you from doing that.
Okay. So you consider that it could be used more strategically? When you have the chance to develop an industry, then you could consider that economic tool. But when it's not, maybe it doesn't make sense.
These guys didn't really view themselves as they were kind of opposed to what we'd call strategic industrial policy, because so they didn't really see themselves as technocrats. They thought, we create the industrial conditions, industry just emerges through the actions of private individuals. So they wouldn't have supported strategic targeting. So we're going to funnel subsidies into this particular industry. To do that, you need to tax all other areas of the economy. So you're hurting the other industries. What they're concerned about is economic diversification rather than strategically targeting industries. But, some of them would have accepted that, that there would be industries that are fundamentally unsuited to the United States, like growing coffee or something. Then we should just lower the tariffs on those things,
And do you think that there is any connection that we could have these days with the competitive advantage? Because I know the colleagues in management probably to see the connection, because we're still talking about the absolute or comparative advantage, but not much about the competitive advantage. I think in Japan, they have some competitive advantages in the technological sector. That's what China wants to do, but maybe US have other more technological in terms of Silicon Valley, for example.
Well, this is about developing competitive advantage. I mean, Japan, after World War II, they didn't adopt free trade. They followed protectionist policies. So did South Korea. When the United States developed, they were protectionists for most of the 19th century. They're using the tariffs to actually develop this competitive advantage.
Well, I think we are over the time, and I just want to thank everyone, and thanking you also online. So thanks a lot, Mathew, and let's enjoy the sandwiches.
Thanks very much.
This is the last seminar.
There wasn't any questions from those online, were there?
Who knows? Probably. Yeah. Let me finish with the recording because I have here this. Stop sharing. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
That was still recording, wasn't it? Even though